I already knew that day would be a turning point, but I confess, I didn't expect to see the judge freeze when he noticed me. The entire room fell silent. The sound of the lawyer's heels, the muffled whispers, even the pen gliding across paper. Everything stopped as if someone had pressed an invisible button. The courtroom, normally so noisy, hung suspended in the air. I felt dozens of eyes piercing through me, and each gaze carried an unspoken message. Some judged me for being there. Others found me strange, as if silently asking, "What is this woman doing in this place?" I was already used to those looks. My whole life I had carried this burden, being the uncomfortable presence, the one who doesn't fit in. Black woman, over 60 years old, simple clothes, discreet posture. Most people only saw me as someone's maid or a service companion. But that judge knew me. Not the way everyone there imagined. When his eyes met mine, his expression betrayed something he was trying to hide. Surprise, fear, and a memory that came from the past. The wooden gavel almost slipped from his hand. He cleared his throat, like someone trying to regain their own dignity before an audience that had already noticed the flaw. I didn't move. I remained seated, hands resting on my lap, with the serenity I learned to cultivate after years of being called insignificant. Inside, my heart was beating like a drum at a festival, but my face was pure silence. They had always known how to silence me with the label of fragile, but they never imagined I could use that silence as armor. Behind me, I heard one of the daughters-in-law whisper, "Who is she anyway?" And another replied, in a poisonous tone that only I could hear, "Must be someone lost." If they only knew. If they had any idea who I really was and what I carried in my purse. Those proofs weren't just papers. They were scars transformed into ammunition. They were years of contempt compressed into documents, recordings, and memories written in my own hand. The judge, still stunned, asked everyone to stand. His voice, which normally sounded firm, wavered. He tried to follow protocol, but the discomfort was clear. It wasn't the courtroom that was on trial at that moment. It was them. That entire family that laughed at me, that treated me like a shadow, that believed I would live and die invisible. While everyone settled back down, I took a deep breath. The heavy air in the room smelled of expensive perfume, worn leather from the chairs, and dust from old papers. Everything seemed to conspire to keep the atmosphere impenetrable, reserved only for the powerful. And there I was, breaking the scene with my simple presence. Nobody understood. Nobody knew. But the chill that ran down the judge's spine announced, the truth I brought was about to change everything. They could barely imagine that this invisible woman hadn't entered there to watch, but to turn the courtroom upside down. They saw me as a faded detail in the scenery. I always knew that. It wasn't new that I learned to occupy space in the most silent way possible. Black woman of 63 years, widow, with life's marks engraved on my face and in my already silver hair. I, to them, was nothing more than a shadow. The shadow that served coffee, that washed clothes, that kept discreet so as not to get in the way. My daughter-in-law once let slip, thinking I wouldn't hear. "Your mother always looks like a soap opera extra, one of those who never have lines." Hurt. Every word hurt like red-hot iron. But I didn't respond. I learned that sometimes silence speaks louder than any scream. The same silence that accompanied me now, in the courtroom. I was sitting in the last row, hands on my lap, eyes down, as I always made a point of appearing. This was my mask. Invisibility. It was what protected me for years. It was what made them underestimate me. What nobody knew is that behind this mask I hid something they would never imagine. Evidence. Fragments of truth that I patiently collected, like someone gathering pieces of broken glass. Messages on cell phones forgotten on the table, recordings of conversations loaded with poison, documents forgotten in drawers they never remembered to lock. I became an expert at being ignored. And it was exactly this ability that allowed me to listen and keep everything they didn't want to come to light. Every time they laughed at me, every time they whispered, "She doesn't understand anything," I smiled inside. 'Cause I knew. I knew that the day would come when that mask would fall. The judge had frozen because he recognized me. But the rest of the courtroom still saw me as any stranger. A faded lady, perhaps lost, perhaps too curious to be there. And I let them think that way. It was part of the plan. While they saw me as nothing, I prepared everything to show that I was everything. That I was the key piece of a story they believed they controlled. The pain I carried all these years now had a purpose. It was no longer just a wound. It was fuel. And if you who are listening to me have ever been treated as invisible, have ever been reduced to silence, have ever been devalued for your color, age, or condition, know this. No mask lasts forever. The moment to show who you really are comes, sooner or later. If you believe this story needs to be told to the end, subscribe to the channel now. Just like me, you also deserve to have your voice heard. And I promise this revelation will still surprise you. They would still laugh at me in that courtroom. But little did they know that I carried in my purse the proof that would change everything. When my husband died, I believed that at least I would have the right to live in peace with the memories. How wrong I was. The morning had barely begun, and they were already around me like vultures over carrion. The family's lawyers surrounded me with cold embraces and words too sweet to be true. "We're here to take care of everything," they said. But what they really wanted was to erase me, as if I were an uncomfortable mistake in his biography. The meetings began without me. Decisions were made in rooms to which I was never invited. One day, while passing through the hallway, I heard one of the nephews say, "We can't let this part fall into her hands." And the answer came dry, loaded with contempt. "She doesn't even understand papers, banks, any of that stuff." My son, the one I carried 9 months in my womb, remained silent. He didn't defend me. He just lowered his head as if he agreed. That silence hurt more than any word. And my daughter-in-law, she always thought herself too refined to share space with me. Once, at a dinner when the inheritance topic came up, she laughed and said loud enough for me to hear, "That money shouldn't mix." The others laughed along. As if I really were a stain to be hidden, an inconvenient presence that embarrassed the lineage. The pain burned, but at the same time it fed me. Because I knew that every word, every laugh, every piercing look could be used against them. Deep down, greed was the engine that moved that family. It wasn't just about money, it was about maintaining control, appearance, the narrative that I had always been the woman who took advantage. As if I hadn't spent decades by his side, caring, working, holding the pieces together when everything seemed to crumble. The courtroom was now full of those same haughty faces. Faces that had already decided my fate without even asking me. I observed them one by one, remembering each humiliation. The birthday when I was relegated to the kitchen. The party when they asked me not to appear in family photos. The time my granddaughter, repeating her mother's words, called me strange in front of her friends. All of this I swallowed in silence. But my silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. They believed I would forever remain in the position of invisible. But they didn't know I was listening, recording, keeping. What my daughter-in-law said at that dinner, with her poisonous laughter, would be the first domino piece that would bring them all down. That night, after the dinner where I was treated like a shadow once more, I decided I would never let those words get lost in the air again. Their poison didn't deserve to disappear into oblivion. I took my saved money and bought a small pocket recorder. Simple, cheap, almost invisible. Just like me. I started carrying it with me to every meeting. At Sunday lunches, hidden inside my crochet bag. In quick meetings at the office, concealed in my coat pocket. Even during walks in the house garden, when secrets spilled between wine glasses and contemptuous laughter. First, my heart raced with every click. The fear of being discovered was real. But I soon realized that nobody ever really looked at me. I could be an arm's length away, and still, they talked as if I were invisible. And that invisibility became my most powerful weapon. The voices were recorded on tapes. "She'll never understand these papers. If it's up to me, this inheritance doesn't pass through those hands." And the phrase that made me tremble with contained hatred, "Women like her are only good for cleaning other people's dirt." I replayed the recordings in the silence of my room, tears streaming, hands trembling. But with each repetition, the pain transformed into strength. Each word was a bullet I saved for the right moment. Each silence of mine was an arrow being pulled back on the bow. It wasn't just words, though. Gradually, I realized their carelessness went beyond poisonous mouths. Papers forgotten on the table. Contracts poorly stored in drawers. Forged signatures that jumped out at my eyes. They were so confident in my invisibility that they didn't bother to hide. Gathered everything, like someone assembling a mosaic with glass shards. I recorded, noted, kept. My life began to revolve around collecting truths that would one day become impossible to deny. During that time I slept little. My heart burned, my eyes stung, but my soul lit up with the certainty that I would no longer be silenced. And in one of those silent searches, among forgotten papers and dusty folders, I found something that would completely change the course of the battle. The proof they could never contest. Among boxes of old files, stored in a stuffy warehouse that smelled of mold and abandonment, I found what I never imagined. I was alone that afternoon. While the others argued loudly in the next room, I rummaged through forgotten folders, torn papers, contracts piled without order. That's when my eyes fell upon a yellowed envelope, already worn by time. Its edges were crumpled, but what was inside was as intact as the memory that still throbbed in my chest. First, I found the original deed to one of the most valuable properties. It wasn't a copy, it wasn't a digitization. It was the document registered at the notary's office, with my husband's signature in firm ink, attesting to what he always knew. Half of everything was mine by right. No matter how much they tried to erase me, the law was written there, in paper and ink, unquestionable. But that wasn't all. Along with the deed, there was a letter, handwritten by him, never sent. I recognized his handwriting immediately, that mixture of strong letters and short strokes. And when I read it, tears flowed without me being able to contain them. He confessed feeling ashamed of the way his family treated me. He apologized, even if in silence, for not having had the courage to defend me so many times. And he said in so many words that he loved me, that I had been his true companion, even when the world insisted on putting me in the shadows. My hands trembled holding those pages. Not from fragility but from certainty. There was the missing piece. It wasn't just recordings, it wasn't just technical papers. It was the confession of a man who, deep down, knew the injustice. It was his voice, even after death, echoing in favor of truth. I sat on the cold floor of the warehouse, with the documents on my lap, and closed my eyes. For the first time in a long time I felt peace. But also a burning flame. It no longer mattered how much they tried to silence me. Now I had not only the legal weapons but also the moral strength. And here's where I say something to you who are listening to me. If one day they tried to erase your history, if they've ever said you had no value, remember that truth finds ways to resist. Sometimes it stays hidden, forgotten in a drawer, but when it appears, it illuminates everything. If you've ever been through situations where they tried to diminish you or exclude you, like this video and leave a comment telling your experience. Your voice might be the echo that another person needs to not feel alone. The letter and the deed wouldn't be displayed just any way. I already knew. If I was going to use them, it would have to be in front of everyone at the moment they least expected it. After finding the letter and the original deed, something changed inside me. I was no longer just a cornered woman, enduring humiliations in silence. I had become a strategist. Every recorded word, every recovered document, every detail ignored by them now became part of a carefully assembled arsenal. I kept everything in colored folders, each color with a purpose. Blue for recordings, green for legal documents, red for racist messages and comments that exposed their true face. I spent hours organizing like someone assembling a delicate puzzle, piece by piece. I knew that isolated evidence could be dismissed as exaggeration. But together, all of them would form a portrait impossible to deny. In front of them, I continued playing the role they expected of me. The silent woman who served coffee at meetings, who withdrew when the conversation got serious. I learned to smile at the right moment, to lower my eyes, to nod as if I didn't understand anything. And while they ignored me, I studied them. Every haughty look, every cutting word, every plan they thought they were hiding from me. It was as if I had two faces. The public one, invisible and docile, and the secret one, firm and calculating. Each day my patience grew, because I knew that revenge wouldn't be in the heat of anger. It would be cold, precise, and public. I didn't just want to win. I wanted to expose. Make each one of them be forced to look at themselves in the mirror and face their own rot in front of witnesses. At night at home I practiced my tone of voice, my posture. I read and reread my husband's letter until I memorized every line. I closed my eyes and imagined the packed courtroom, the confident faces transforming into masks of terror when they realized that I, the invisible woman, was the one who held the key to everything. And the more I prepared, the more I felt the strength that always existed within me, but which they tried to suffocate. It wasn't just about inheritance or money. It was about dignity. It was about showing that kindness doesn't mean weakness and that silence doesn't mean submission. When the hearing date was set, I felt a chill down my spine. But it wasn't fear. It was anticipation. I knew that would be the final scene of a play they had mounted, trusting too much in their own arrogance. And when the big day came, the entire courtroom became a stage. And I, the leading actress of a revelation that nobody would ever forget. The courtroom dawned filled with an air of spectacle. The benches were packed with distant relatives, curious neighbors, discreet journalists, and familiar faces from the city. For them, this would be just another dragged-out inheritance trial. For me, it was the stage where I would stop being invisible. I entered with firm steps, even though my heart was hammering inside my chest. My outfit was simple but carefully chosen, a sober dark dress and a blue scarf that belonged to my mother. It was my talisman. I wanted everyone to see me as they always had, discreet, faded, so that the impact would be even greater when I removed the mask. The family was all there. Raised faces, expensive perfumes, clothes aligned as if it were a fashion show. My daughter-in-law was adjusting the pearl necklace on her neck, smiling with superiority. My son, sitting beside her, avoided my gaze. I searched for his face, but he pretended not to see me. Hurt. But at the same time it strengthened me. When the judge entered, heavy silence fell. He walked to the high chair, adjusted his robe, and then saw me. For an instant, his eyes lost their firmness. It wasn't just recognition. It was memory. He had seen me before, in another case years ago when my husband was still alive. At that time, he treated me as a mere background character. Now, faced with the evidence I brought, he knew he couldn't ignore me. The lawyers began their speeches with their usual confidence. Beautiful words, technical jargon, veiled attacks on my lack of preparation. They said I had no conditions to manage assets, that my presence in the dispute was inappropriate. The audience listened, some nodded. I remained silent, motionless, as if I were once again that faded woman they described. But inside, every sentence was fuel. Every attempt to reduce me only made my revelation sweeter. I observed the ironic smiles, the confident exchanges of glances. They were too secure, too confident. They didn't know that every word would be swallowed back in front of everyone. While the lawyer's speech continued, I felt the metallic cold of the folder in my hands. Inside it, the original deed, the letter, the recordings, the transcriptions. Each piece carefully organized, waiting only for the right moment. My fingers tightened the folder's handle. My breathing steadied. I knew the time was coming. When I stood up to ask for the floor, the lawyer's mocking laughter echoed through the room. Little did he know he was about to choke on his own scorn. I stood up slowly, like someone who's in no hurry, but knows exactly where they're going. The leather of the bench creaked under my weight, and for a moment all eyes turned to me. Their lawyer, an arrogant man with rehearsed speech, couldn't resist and let out a mocking laugh. "Your Honor, with all respect, this lady has no legitimacy to speak." His voice cut through the air like a blade. Many in the audience murmured in agreement, Others smiled as if it were already a ready joke. But then the judge raised his hand and said with a firm voice, "I grant her the floor." The silence that followed was almost sacred. I took a deep breath, opened the folder and with steady hands, took out the first envelope. It wasn't just any paper. It was the transcribed recording of a family conversation where my daughter-in-law said, laughing, "That money shouldn't mix." The recording echoed in the room, and her laughter, once poison in my chest, was now evidence before everyone. Her eyes widened. She tried to disguise it, adjusting her pearl necklace, but the blush rose to her face. The lawyer shifted in his chair, swallowing hard. The people in the courtroom began exchanging uncomfortable glances. What before seemed like a bureaucratic dispute now became a spectacle of falling masks. I didn't stop there. I placed the original deed on the judge's table. He took the document with serious hands, examined the signature, the authentication, and looked at me in a way that said, "This changes everything." The whispers grew in the room. The family's confidence began to crack. And then the letter. My husband's voice, even after death, crossing the years and rescuing me from silence. I read excerpts aloud. His shame at the way I was treated, his recognition of my value, his love written with every stroke of the pen. The words weighed on everyone present there, especially on those who called me nothing. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to raise my tone. The weight of the evidence spoke for me. Each page was a stone thrown against the wall of arrogance they had built. The family was stunned. My daughter-in-law was biting her lips. My son couldn't face me. The audience was divided between shock and embarrassment. I just remained firm, with the serenity of someone who waited years for that moment. If you've ever seen someone be treated as invisible, but who deep down carried a truth capable of changing everything, share this story. Maybe it's the courage another person needs to also stand up. What nobody knew was that I still kept one last blow, and it was already beyond the walls of that courtroom. The room was still in shock when I closed the folder, calmly, like someone who knows the game is already won. But I hadn't shown all the cards. What they didn't know, and what would make that revelation definitive, was that none of it depended just on me anymore. I took out my cell phone. The screen lit up, reflecting in my glasses, and a murmur ran through the courtroom. It wasn't common for someone to interrupt a trial with such a simple gesture, but there, nothing was common anymore. I pressed a button, and with a swipe of fingers I showed everyone. All those documents, audios and transcriptions were already stored in the cloud, sent to local journalists, independent lawyers and community groups. Even if you try to hide, my voice sounded clear, firm. There's no going back now. The world out there already knows who you are. It was as if the ground had vanished from under their feet. The lawyer's eyes widened, searching for words that wouldn't come. My daughter-in-law lost the color from her face, as if all the blood had fled. My son. My son just lowered his head, unable to face the weight of his own choice. The people in the benches began to whisper. Some laughed quietly, others shook their heads in disapproval. What before seemed like just a cold dispute over goods now transformed into a public spectacle of shame. The courtroom was no longer just a courtroom. It was the stage of a truth that could no longer be contained. I took a deep breath, feeling for the first time the lightness of not carrying that burden alone. For years, I endured piercing looks, whispers, muffled laughter that reduced me to dust. But now it was no longer me against them. It was me and the truth against the lie. It was me and the community against silence. While the judge called for order in the room, I realized that something bigger had happened. They could try to distort papers, manipulate meetings, exclude me from photos and memories. But they could no longer erase what was already exposed beyond those walls. The wound they tried to hide had been opened for the world to see. I didn't smile, I didn't celebrate. I just closed my eyes for a moment, letting the force of the moment pass through me. But the greatest response was yet to come, not from me, but from the very voice of justice. The judge's gavel rested heavy on the table. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for thunder after lightning. The judge adjusted his robe, cleared his throat, and slowly leafed through the documents I had delivered. Each page turned sounded like a crack inside my tormentor's chests. He raised his eyes, swept the room with a firm gaze, and said, "Given the evidence presented, there is no doubt that the lady is the legitimate heir to a substantial part of the estate." The sound of the gavel coming down echoed like thunder on those walls. It was short, dry, definitive. The reaction was immediate. My daughter-in-law brought her hand to her mouth, as if she could prevent the scream of rage that was escaping. My son looked at the floor, ashamed, unable to meet my eyes. The lawyer stumbled over his own words, trying to formulate a non-existent appeal. The audience murmured, some shook their heads in disapproval, others smiled discreetly at the fall of the arrogant. I, however, remained firm. I didn't raise my hands in celebration. I didn't cry with relief. I just breathed deeply. That victory wasn't a gift. It was a conquest. Every tear swallowed in silence, every piercing look endured, every poisonous laugh that I stuck in my chest like a thorn, all of this now transformed into justice. For a moment, I felt the weight of the entire room change. The same people who before looked at me as an intruder now looked at me with respect. I was no longer the silent shadow, but the woman who raised her own voice in the middle of a courtroom and exposed the rot of a family that believed itself untouchable. The judge spoke again firmly. "From today on, it is recorded that the lady has the right not only to part of the assets, but also to full recognition as the legitimate wife of the deceased." Those words pierced me like a precise arrow. It wasn't just about money, it was about identity, dignity, history. I closed my eyes for a moment. I remembered my husband's letter, the lines where he confessed shame for not having defended me. Well, now, from somewhere he was watching. And finally, his omission had been corrected by the strength of my voice. But there was still the final blow, not that of formal justice, but that of my own mouth, carrying truths that would burn in everyone's memory forever. I stood up slowly. The chair creaking broke the heavy silence of the courtroom. All eyes turned to me, but for the first time they didn't see me as a shadow. They saw me as the center. I held the folder firmly against my chest, took a deep breath, and let my voice cross the space. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. Each word came out clear, firm, loaded with a lifetime of being choked. Kindness is not weakness. Silence is not submission. The sound echoed between the wood-paneled walls. I saw my son shudder, as if he had finally understood. My daughter-in-law, with downcast eyes, bit her lip to contain her rage. The lawyers no longer had arguments, just tense faces of those who know they've lost. I continued. "You laughed at me, called me nothing, said I didn't deserve to share the bread, the table, or the name. But today, before everyone, you heard the truth. My voice." The silence was so deep that I could hear the hurried breathing of people in the back benches. Some looked at me with tears in their eyes, others with the shame that should fall on my tormentors. I approached the judge's table not to plead but to affirm. I didn't need to raise my hand against anyone. I didn't need violence. All I needed was what you yourselves let slip. Your own arrogance. You gave me the weapons, and I just returned them before justice. With each sentence, I felt a weight leaving my shoulders. It was as if decades of silencing were dissolving into dust. I wasn't just speaking for myself, but for all Black, mature women who were treated as invisible within their own families. I saw the judge observe me in silence, with something close to respect stamped on his face. I saw the audience lean their heads, attentive to every word. I saw my daughter-in-law, once haughty, now smaller than ever. And in that instant I understood. I had already won even before the sentence. Because my voice, finally, had returned to exist. But I still had one last thing to say. Not just to the courtroom, but to everyone who ever confused my kindness with weakness. I took a deep breath. I looked at each face before me. Those who despised me, those who doubted, and even those who remained silent when they should have defended me. There was no hatred in my chest, there was justice. I spent years believing that silence was my only place. My words sounded firm, unhurried. But today I understood that silence can also be a choice. I chose to be quiet to listen. I chose to wait to act. And I chose to speak only when my voice would be impossible to ignore. With each sentence, I felt the years of humiliation dissolving. It wasn't just about inheritance, nor just about documents. It was about dignity. About showing that kindness is not synonymous with submission and that patience doesn't mean weakness. I looked at the judge, then at my daughter-in-law, at my son, at all those who underestimated me. You wanted to erase me, but what you did was make me unforgettable. Justice may be slow, but when it arrives, it doesn't ask permission. It enters, illuminates, exposes. And I am here as living proof of that. A murmur ran through the room like a wave. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed. Others looked at me with respect, perhaps even admiration. I wasn't seeking applause. I was seeking truth. And there it was, naked before everyone. I felt my heart beat calmly. For the first time in a long time, calmly. I took my husband's letter, folded it carefully, and put it back in the folder. I smiled slightly, not for them but for myself. This was the end of a story of silences, but also the beginning of a new life. A life where I no longer needed to hide behind masks. And if you're listening to me now, keep one thing. Don't underestimate the power of your voice. It doesn't matter if they try to silence you, if they say you have no value, if they treat you like a shadow. Your truth may be stored, hidden, suffocated. But it doesn't die. At the right moment, it resurfaces. And when that happens, nobody can stop it. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel. Because here, every silenced voice finds space to echo, and every invisible story can transform into strength. Together, we show that dignity is not negotiable and that kindness should never be confused with weakness. I left the courtroom without looking back. The doors closed behind me, but justice had opened forever.